All right, so really fast, elephant in the room. We pre-recorded the music last week because Matthew is out of town, and I had the opportunity to get a haircut. And I was fully committed to not talking about my hair at all because Rob has already talked about Cowboy Rob. Luann a couple weeks ago said that the Loft staff is so vain because we keep talking about our hair. And I was minorly triggered, and now here I am talking about my hair. I got a haircut, so for continuity's sake, I figured I had to at least address it. So touche, Luann, you caught me. And here we are, starting out talking about haircuts here at the Loft again. But y'all, I know we've said it a lot, but truly, I hope you know that we are counting down the days until we get to meet with you again in person. And we really are longing for it. And we really are praying for you during this season. And so look forward to worshiping with y'all in this room again soon. So it probably doesn't come as a big surprise to y'all that music has always spoken deeply to me since a very early age. But before we get there, I want to ask a very important question of y'all right now, and this is interactive. So in the chat, I want to just see your responses, and it's this. It's a really big question. What is your favorite Disney movie of all time? What is your favorite Disney movie of all time? I'm not asking what is the best Disney movie of all time. I'm asking what is your favorite Disney movie of all time? I feel like you probably aren't going to hear what I have to say for the next 5 minutes because you could probably talk about this for a really long time. I asked this question on my Facebook this past week and got a ton of responses. The overwhelming majority of people said things like The Little Mermaid was really popular on that list. Aladdin was really popular on that list. The Lion King was up on that list. I can tell you right now that my little daughter, Eleanor, it's really sweet. When she's kind of like losing her mind or having a meltdown right now, we already know that we can turn on the bare necessities from Jungle Book on YouTube and she immediately is pacified. She like loves that song. She's just a little over 3 months old and I'm already sick of bare necessities. So I can't imagine what it's gonna be like when I have to watch like the same movie over and over and over again with her. But I'm thankful that it's at least a song that I like in a book or in a movie that I like. So I'm gonna tell you what my favorite movie of all time is when it comes to Disney movies. And that is the movie Dumbo. Only one person out of like 150 plus comments on my Facebook said Dumbo, but Dumbo is my favorite movie of all time. And a couple weeks ago, I was at Harvest and I was talking to the Woodlands music team. And honestly, one of the really cool things about this season has been really just doing ministry alongside the Woodlands music team and being able to partner with Brenna and with Michael Rafferty and Matthew and RT and all being together. But we were talking about favorite Disney movies of all time. When I said Dumbo, Brenna Bullock started laughing so hard that I thought she was going to start crying. I still don't really know what's so funny about it, but she said something along the lines of, she goes, sorry, I was born in the 90s, so that's a little before my era. And I don't know if you all know, but the movie was made in 1941, so I'm not sure how old Brenna thinks that I am, but it's also well before my era as well. I just think that Dumbo is an absolutely fantastic movie, and this conversation has like raged on. We've still been talking about it. We led worship at Wood Forest last week, and we were still talking about our favorite Disney movie. But Dumbo is my favorite Disney movie of all time. But my second favorite Disney movie of all time is The Little Mermaid. My earliest memories of my childhood, I remember getting as close as I could to the TV screen. I don't know why that's a thing when you're like a really young kid, but I did it with video games too. Like the closer you got, the better you got at playing the game. But I get like as close as I could to the screen, and I just be like, I think I was actually pretty close. I don't know. It was pretty close. But I would sit there as like a 4-year-old kid and just be like, oh my gosh, I want to sing like this one day. And I would just sing along to The Little Mermaid. And I think that I probably still sing high like I do because my first voice lessons were from a mermaid, which is the worst dad joke that I'll make during this entire sermon, I promise. But music has always spoken deeply to me in my life, even in the earliest memories that I have of those good old Disney days with The Little Mermaid. But you fast forward a few years, And I remember that my favorite day of the week became New Release Tuesdays. So New Release Tuesdays were when new movies came out, but it was also when new music came out. And I remember I'd get so excited. There was a Kmart right down the street from my house. Rest in peace, Kmart. I haven't seen one in a really long time. But on Tuesdays, my parents would take me to Kmart, and I would pick up whatever the new single of the week was on a CD, and it would have like 3 or 4 different versions, like different remix versions. And that became like my favorite day of the week to go get the new single. And around that same era, you could also take tapes. I would sit next to the radio when I get home from school. And I remember sitting next to the radio, waiting until the radio DJ would stop talking to hit record, which I'm fairly certain is illegal. It hit record so I could so I could record my favorite songs on a tape. And I make mixtapes for all my friends and mixtapes for me, mixtapes for the girls that I thought were my girlfriends when I was like 9 years old and it didn't even mean anything. But music had always spoken deeply to me at a very early age. You fast forward a little bit, I come from a very sports-centric family. Like, my family absolutely loves baseball, so I played a lot of sports growing up. And look, I don't believe wholeheartedly in like the different tropes of who you are in the lineage in which you are born in your family, the firstborn, the middle child. But I was the middle child, and I was kind of the outcast of my family, so sports was a big deal. But I remember getting home from baseball practice, and I would lock myself in my room, and I would turn on some jams and start singing along. And some of my earliest memories of that was, I remember loving Brian McKnight. Anyone? Any Brian McKnight fans? I mean, I just sit in my room, and it was like, 1, you're like a dream come true, 2. And then the second on my tape is I would listen to so much Boyz II Men. And if you don't like Boyz II Men, there's already a schism between us because they were unbelievable. I was a huge Boyz II Men fan. I'm not gonna lie, I really just wanted to sing a line of Brian McKnight in the middle of a sermon and say that I sang Brian McKnight in church. And no, I've done it, so I can die a happy person. But music has always spoken deeply into my life. And I believe that music speaks a language that words alone just can't. Music can speak to us in a way that words alone just can't. I'm sure that probably some of you have songs that if you hear it today, you're reminded of exactly where you were when you heard it. You're reminded of the exact emotions that you felt when you heard the song for the very first time. Maybe for some of you, there's even songs you can't listen to because they bring back hurt or heartbreak that you just don't want to feel. You know, I think back to just to me, when I hear the early Beatles songs, it brings back so much joy because it reminds me of my childhood. When I hear things like I Want to Hold Your Hand or Ticket to Ride, it reminds me of just joyfulness. I hear it and it immediately just evokes joy for me, even though I'm a much bigger fan of the later Beatles stuff. I think Sgt. Pepper's is the greatest album of all time. Not to be divisive here or anything, but it's an amazing record. But then I remember going through the phase of punk rock, the punk rock phase as I was going into high school. And to this day, I can hear a Blink-182 song and I'm still like, yeah, mom and dad don't get me, because I had the teenage angst as I was listening to punk rock. I can still remember the emotions that I felt. Or maybe for some of you, you can think back to the first time that you ever heard My Heart Will Go On from the Titanic soundtrack. So I was in junior high and I remember that my girlfriend and I broke up. I was in like 7th or 8th grade, and that became like my I'm gonna wallow in self-pity jam, listening to Celine Dion, My Heart Will Go On. But truly, music, it speaks a language that words alone can't. It speaks a language that words alone cannot. And y'all, this is one of the reasons why I love the Psalms so much. Really, if you read through the book of Psalms, there's just the fullness of raw human emotion. I'm sure that no matter what you're going through in your life right now, there is a psalm that can speak into your life. And the fullness of the range of human emotion, of raw human emotion, is found throughout the book of Psalms. I'll give a couple examples. Maybe you're feeling sadness. Psalm 42, starting at verse 1, says this: "As the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you, my God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When can I go to meet with God?" Hear this: "My tears have been my food day and night." Or maybe you've gone through seasons, or you're in a season of loneliness. Hear Psalm chapter 25. Turn to me and be gracious to me, for I am lonely and afflicted. Or maybe you're in a season of joy. Psalm chapter 4, verse 7 says this: you have put more joy in my heart than they have when their grain and wine abound. Listen to that one again. It's so good. You have put more joy in my heart than they have when their grain and their wine abound. What does that mean? That means that no matter the material possessions of the people around me, no matter what I ascertain that is material in this life, it pales in comparison to the joy of knowing the Lord. I mean, it's exactly what Rob preached about last week. I think all of us can declare that psalm over our lives. No matter what we have on this earth, it pales in comparison to knowing our God and being known by our God. The psalmist continues in that same chapter and he talks about peace. In peace, I will both lie down and sleep. For you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. Just knowing that the Lord has got you, and it brings you to such a state of peace that you can lie down at night in stillness and fall asleep, just knowing that the Lord has you, that you can be in peace. No matter what you are going through, there's a psalm that can offer you encouragement and speak into your circumstance and speak into your situation. Just a sidebar, one of the other reasons I love the Psalms so much is because they're so incredibly personal. They're not talking about a God who seems distant and far away, because he's not. I mean, really, that's kind of the cornerstone of what we celebrate in Christianity, right? That we have a God who took on human flesh, that stepped into time, that would walk alongside of his people, a God who can empathize with us. He is a personal and intimate God that we can come before, and the psalmist believes it. When you read the Psalms, they're incredibly personal, and I love that about the Psalms. I became a Christian right before my senior year of high school in 2003, and the Psalms became like my jam. Like, they became my book. When I first became a Christian, after I kind of understood just probably a very rudimentary understanding of the gospel, the first book of the Bible that I read was the book of James. To this day, like, the first verses that I ever memorized were in the book of James. But the second book that I started reading through were the book of Psalms. And I remember beginning to read them and going, oh my gosh, this author speaks my language. I can understand this. And there was, and one of the jokes that I always make to people is a very, very silly joke, is that I don't think it's by accident that the largest book in our Bible is a giant hymnal. I don't think that's an accident. I think it's because music speaks a language that words alone cannot speak. Music does something. It softens the heart. It pierces the heart. It makes us open to the words in which we are proclaiming and the words in which we are singing. But I remember the first psalm that ever stood out to me as a new believer. And I want to just read this psalm over you and over your lives today. And y'all, you might be busy right now. You might be in the midst of chaos right now. You might have kids yelling in your living room right now. But if there's any chance that you can just be still and just allow this to be read over you. We believe that God's word is alive and active. That's what Hebrews 4:12 says. That it is God-breathed, 2 Timothy 3:16. So I just want to read this over you, trusting that God is going to speak into your life as we read the scriptures. Psalm 46, starting in verse 1. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam and the mountains quake with their surging. Some of your Bibles right after that, it's going to have this word Selah. And scholars have been divided for a long time on what that word means. A lot of them means that it would mean that you would pause and think through what you had just sung. That it was important enough for you to just sit there and rest and think about it. So you would just sit there and think about those three verses. Others think that it may have meant it's a time of instrumental or it's a time of repetition. You would sing it again. But what we can kind of come to a conclusion of is this. It means that what we just said was important. That God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in times of trouble. We will not fear though the earth give way. So we declare that. And then verse 4. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God. Y'all, I don't want to dive too much into this, but something that stood out to me this week is that these first 3 verses, they're talking about our earthly situations. When we look around us and we see the world crumbling around us, and we see this language about the seas being tumultuous. And then all of a sudden in verse 4, it switches over to the kingdom of God. What does the kingdom look like? And instead of the seas raging war and being tumultuous, we read this: there is a river whose streams make glad the city of God. The vision of the psalmist has gone from their circumstance to the kingdom. The holy place where the Most High dwells. God is within her. She will not fall. God will will help her at the break of day. Nations are in uproar. Kingdoms fall. He lifts his voice. The earth melts. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Come and see what the Lord has done, the desolations he has brought on the earth. He makes wars cease. Our God is powerful to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the shields with fire. And here's probably the most well-known verse in this psalm. He says, "Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress." I read a commentary last week that said this. I love this quote. The psalmist's statement of the security of God's people in trouble describes a time in terms of worldwide upheavals and disasters. Y'all, that's why I think this psalm speaks to our current circumstance right now. But I want to read just a little bit about the context of this psalm, and here's the reason why. I think it's going to bring this psalm to life in a way that maybe it's not come to life before for you, because I know that it's taken on a whole new meaning for me as I've just been able to dive deep and get to know this psalm a little bit better. And again, the reason I want to do this is I think it speaks to our current circumstances today, and I truly believe if we lean in, there is hope for us in which our gaze and our vision will go off of our circumstances and situation, not ignoring it, but it would then look to the Lord and believe that he is our refuge, he is our safety, and he is our strength. So the context is this. The Assyrian army, this is in the 700s BC, the Assyrian army is threatening a king whose name is Hezekiah and threatening the city of Jerusalem. Hezekiah is an amazing figure in the Old Testament, and one of the cool things about Hezekiah is he is part of the lineage of Jesus. So we're seeing the lineage of Jesus here 700 years before Jesus walked the earth in human flesh. And another cool side note that I found as I studied is that King Hezekiah, there is an immense amount of extra biblical archaeological evidence to who he was and this time period. So it's just a cool thing. It kind of brings it more to life. So the Assyrians are threatening King Hezekiah in Jerusalem. But I just want to read to you the character of Hezekiah for a second before we dive into this story. We're going to be in 2 Kings chapter 18 and 19. That's where all of this comes from. But starting in verse 3 in chapter 18. King Hezekiah did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father David had done. He removed the high places, smashed the sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah poles. So these Asherah poles were really simply, they were these structures that were constructed by the Canaanites as idols to their little g gods. And so we're told that King Hezekiah comes in and he cuts them down. And then in verse 5, Hezekiah trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel. So he comes into Jerusalem and he's looking around and he's seeing the idols that people have made. And he says, nothing is gonna stand before our God. He's gonna be the most important for us, the people of God. So he comes in and he starts taking down all the idols. Why? Because he trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel. So the Assyrian army, they had this king. This is a really hard name to say. His name was Sennacherib. So King Sennacherib was the king of the Assyrians, and he had captured and overtaken the surrounding lands. So Judah and Samaria. It's really hard to put this into like a modern context, but I tried to think for a second. It'd be like us in the woodlands and seeing the armies take over Conroe and take over Tomball and take over Magnolia. And we're just sitting here and we're like, well, we've got trees. You know, you're looking around and You're realizing that the enemy is surrounding you 360 degrees. And then all of a sudden the king, he looks to you and he says, you are next. That is the situation that King Hezekiah and the people of Jerusalem were in. This great army, this strong army is coming and wants to overtake them. So King Sennacherib, he sends the supreme commander. I'm not kidding. That's really what he's called. And I can't help but think of a villain from like a Star Wars movie every time I read that. But he sends a supreme commander to mock the Israelites. In 2 Kings chapter 18, starting in verse 28, we read this. Then the commander stood and called out in Hebrew, hear the word of the great king, the king of Assyria. This is what the king says. Do not let Hezekiah deceive you. He cannot deliver you from my hand. Do not let Hezekiah persuade you to trust in the Lord when he says, the Lord will surely deliver us. This city will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. So they're mocking him. They're not only mocking King Hezekiah and the people of Jerusalem, they are mocking the one true God. That's how arrogant they are. They've taken over the surrounding lands, and they're saying, you're next. So then think about that in the context of this psalm. So have this psalm, Psalm 46, just in the back of your mind as we continue to go through this story. So think about it. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear. What? But we're surrounded by the enemy. But we are completely overwhelmed. And we are on the edge of defeat. But don't fear? Like, I don't know about y'all, but that seems counterintuitive to the circumstance in which they were in. And y'all, it might seem counterintuitive to some of the circumstances and situations that we find ourselves in. And here's what stands out to me about this story as we continue, is that King Hezekiah does not ignore his circumstances. He makes his gaze, he makes his vision right. He looks at his circumstances, yet he still believes his God is bigger, his God is better, and his God will be his deliverer. So how does Hezekiah respond to this? Well, we read in the story that Hezekiah then, he tears his clothes. In the Old Testament, this would have been an expression of sorrow, an expression of pain. He sees the plight of his people, and he sees the overwhelming odds that are stacked against him, and he tears his clothes in sorrow. He doesn't ignore his situation. And then it says that he puts on sackcloth, and this is a sign of submission to God and a sign of overwhelming grief. He submits. He says, God, I'm grieving right now. Guys, it's okay to grieve. There are seasons of lamenting. There are seasons in which situations and circumstances can seem overwhelming. But Hezekiah doesn't just stay and dwell in that place. He then submits to the Lord. I wasn't really planning on sharing this, but about an hour and a half ago, I got a phone call that Deanna's 96-year-old grandmother just tested positive for COVID-19. And she was supposed to meet Eleanor, our baby, this spring, but we had to cancel our plans because of everything that's going on right now. And Deanna, she called me right before I walked into Loft, and she was just weeping. And all I could think is, that's understandable. That's understandable in this situation. What I love so much about my wife is it didn't end there. She was grieving and she was weeping, and she just said, I need you to pray for me, and I need you to pray for her right now. So she sees the fullness of how big of a situation this is, how dire these circumstances are. And then she said, but we need to bring our prayers and petitions and go before the Lord. And that's what Hezekiah does. He tears his clothes in grief. He puts on sackcloth in submission to the Lord and his will. And then he fixes his gaze and his vision on the Lord. Here's what he does next. Hezekiah then sends for a prophet whose name is Isaiah. and he asks him to prophesy over Jerusalem. And then Hezekiah falls on his face in prayer before the Lord. And we read his prayer in 2 Kings chapter 19. Here's what he says. It is true, Lord, that the Assyrian kings have laid waste these nations and their lands. Again, hear that. He does not ignore his situation or his plight. It continues in verse 18. They have thrown their gods into the fire and destroyed them, for they were not gods, but only wood and stone, fashioned by human hands. Now, Lord our God, deliver us from his hand, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone, Lord, are God. And at the exact same time that King Hezekiah is doing this, Isaiah is prophesying and praying alongside of him. We read in 2 Kings 19, starting in verse 22, this is what Isaiah says. Who is it that you have ridiculed and blasphemed against the Holy One of Israel? Y'all, again, bear in mind the psalm in which is singing and talking about this. The armies are surrounding them, but they are still declaring that God is their refuge, their safety, and their strength in the midst of their situation and their circumstance. And God responds to them. Why? Because we have a God who listens, we have a God who hears, and we have a personal God who speaks. 2 Kings 19, verse 34. This is what God says. I will defend this city and save it for my sake and for the sake of David, my servant. And this happens, are you ready? This is unreal. So that same night, this is what happens. 2 Kings 19, verse 35. The angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. It's an amazing story. They were overwhelmed, the army surrounding them. I mean, not ignoring their situation, but knowing how big of a deal this was, that they would come in grief before the Lord, and they would fully submit before the Lord, and then they would go before him and ask for him who is their safety in their time of need. So again, let's read Psalm 46, verses 1 through 3, and keep in mind this story that this psalm is about, because it makes it come to life and speak, I think, differently to us. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam and the mountains quake with their surging. This word refuge, it simply just means this. It's a shelter or a safety, a shelter or a safety. We could go into a lot of detail about what that means in the Old Testament, because there were cities of refuge where if you committed a crime before someone could seek vengeance or retribution, if you made it to a city of refuge, you were protected and you were guaranteed a trial. So it was a place that you could go and know that you would be safe, that God is our refuge. He is our safety. He is our shelter. I'm gonna share a story that's probably a little TMI, but that's all right because we're all family here. So I immediately, as I was just thinking about this, I was thinking about something that Deanna says to me a lot. And some of you probably know this. Deanna's biggest love language is by far physical touch, all right? She's a hugger. I think this season is driving her crazy because she just wants to hug people. I'm so thankful we have a baby that she can hug on. And but she is like physical touch to the max. Like Myers-Briggs, she's an F, all right? And for those of you that know me, I've made jokes in the past that I am the most awkward when it comes to physical touch. Like, I don't know whether to shake your hand, bust a rock, like do the shoulder bump, or to give you a hug. I never know. It always feels uncomfortable. And believe it or not, we're in like day 5,000 of quarantine, and I'm ready for some hugs. Like, I'm over it, all right? I'm ready to hug people. But Deanna cares deeply about physical touch. And I know this about Deanna. When Deanna is in a season of mourning, when Deanna is hurting, when Deanna is maybe even a season of anxiety, those things don't really happen a whole lot with Deanna because she's a very joyful person. But what I know that Deanna needs the most is for me to hold her. I know that Deanna just needs me to wrap my arms around her. And this is what Deanna says to me every single time. 11 years of marriage, and she still says, This is my favorite place, and this is my safest place. And it means the world to me every single time. Y'all, we have a God who is our refuge. He is our safety. He is our shelter. No matter your circumstance, we have a God whose arms they are open. And that is our favorite place. That is our safest place. He is ready and willing and open to embrace his children. It's funny, I make the joke all the time. I don't really know why Deanna feels that way because I'm kind of a wuss. I'm actually like scared of spiders. It's a true story. Probably just ruined the moment by sharing that part, but it is what it is. We have an ongoing agreement in our marriage that I kill the cockroaches and she kills the spiders. I just ruined the moment. Sick. I'm going to move on now. All right. Refuge. God is our safety and our shelter. There's another word that the psalmist used here that's really important. He says that he is an ever-present help in times of trouble. The word present could literally be translated to mean this, that God is immediately accessible. That God is immediately accessible. That's what that means, ever-present, immediately accessible. I've told you all in the past that I write some really like chicken scratch notes and I try to preach from it. And the reason I do it is because I write in the margins of here little questions that I ask myself or little prayers that I want to pray as I am going through these passages. And here's one of the things that I wrote to myself. I just said this: Hezekiah and Isaiah believed that God was immediately accessible. Do you? Do I? Do you believe that he is accessible? Because he is. That's a promise from God's word, that he is accessible, that he is an ever-present help in times of trouble. Therefore, we will not fear. That we would run to the arms of the Father. Just wanted to share this short story because I think it's powerful. But in 1517, probably one of the greatest moments in the history of the world was this moment that took place on October 31st, and it was the beginning of a moment called the Reformation, where Martin Luther saw that the Catholic Church of old, they were selling indulgences. They were corrupt in a lot of ways. And Martin Luther, he famously wrote the 95 Thesis, all the things that he thought the Catholic Church was doing wrong, and he nailed them to the church doors on October 31st, 1517. And when Martin Luther did that, as you can only imagine, he immediately became a fugitive. Why? Because the Catholic Church was powerful, and so was the Roman Empire. In 1521, Pope Leo X formally excommunicated Martin Luther from the Catholic Church. Then 3 months later, Martin Luther was brought on trial before the Roman Emperor Charles V. And he defiantly stood before him and said he would not take back his words. And he was declared an outlaw and a heretic by the Roman Empire. He was fearful. He was scared because people were coming after him. You can read stories about friends who helped him hide in different fortresses and different places to get away from the Roman Empire. And he had friends in Germany who kind of helped protect him. But something that stood out to me about this story is that as a fugitive, Martin Luther's psalm became Psalm 46. And then he famously wrote a hymn that's called "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God." And what I read in my studies is that Psalm 46 and "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God" was called this. It was called the battle hymn of the Reformation. The battle hymn of the Reformation. All the peoples around him, wanted him dead because he was a heretic. But he believed that God was a mighty fortress, that he was his refuge, that he is our strength. To make our vision right, we don't ignore what is going on around us. We turn to God, our shelter, our refuge, who is immediately accessible for his people. And this is how the psalmist ends. I love it. Psalm 46, starting in verse 10. He says, "Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress." Declare that over your life today, because it is true today in our present circumstance.